Before time had shape, before the stars first shimmered in the velvet sky, before the oceans had tides or the earth had corners, there were only stories. Stories whispered in the flicker of a flame, etched into clay, painted on vases and sung in trembling verse beneath open skies. These were the myths, not just tales of gods and monsters, but profound attempts to explain what could not yet be understood. Why the sun rises, why the wind howls, why we dream, why we love, and why we are mortal. Greek mythology, like a living river, flowed through the ancient world, from the lips of poets to the chisels of sculptors, from the halls of philosophers to the homes of farmers. These stories did not begin as entertainment. They were explanations, maps of meaning, moral warnings, and dreams carved into language. For the ancient Greeks, myth was not fiction, it was a way of seeing the world. Even today, long after the temples crumbled and the oracles fell silent, their myths remain vibrant and echoing. They survive through the verses of Homer, who sang of war and wandering, through Hesiod, who chronicled the birth of gods and the toil of men, through dramatists like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, whose tragedies gave shape to fate and flaw, and through the images painted on vases carved into marble or passed from storyteller to student, generation after generation. But we must be careful not to mistake mythology for a fixed doctrine. Greek myth never had a single book, a single truth, or even a single version. The gods shifted names, stories changed with time, and heroes could be villains in a different town. The beauty of myth lies not in certainty, but in flexibility, in the way it reflects both the divine and the deeply human. Tonight we will walk gently and slowly through that world, not to memorize but to feel, not to judge but to understand. We begin not with Zeus, not with Olympus, not even with the earth. We begin with something much older, something nameless and vast. We begin with chaos, not chaos as in disorder, but chaos as the Greeks understood it, the very first existence, a yawning void, a breathless expanse, a silent, formless opening before form, before time, before light. Chaos was not evil or good, it simply was. The raw canvas upon which all things would one day be painted, it held no stars, no gods, no people, only potential, only space. From this vast emptiness, something remarkable happened, a slow stirring, a shift in the stillness, and from chaos the first beings emerged, not born in the way mortals are born, but unfolding as if the universe itself was beginning to remember its own name. But we will come to them soon enough. For now, dear listener, let your mind drift. Picture a time before the oceans had waves, before trees had roots, before the moon had a name, a time when there was no day or night, only the endless hush of possibility. And so we close our eyes and begin with chaos and the breath that follows, chaos and the primordial deities. In the beginning there was no earth, no sky, no stars, only chaos, not chaos in the modern sense, not noise, not confusion, but chaos as the ancient Greeks knew it, a vast, gaping chasm, a great nothingness. It was the first thing to exist, without shape, without color, without direction. It was not a god, but a presence, silent, deep, and unfathomably wide. It had no will, no voice, no warmth. It simply was, stretching endlessly in every direction, untouched by light, unmarked by time. From this yawning void, creation began, slowly, quietly. The first sparks of existence did not roar into being, they unfolded, as if the universe had taken its first gentle breath. From chaos came the primordial beings, not born in the way mortals are, but emerging, full and eternal, like truths written into the fabric of the world. The first of these was Gaia, the earth. She did not rise on the earth. She was the earth, a goddess vast and ancient, whose body was the land, the hills, the valleys, the soil. She was fertile and enduring, the very foundation of the cosmos. Gaia held within her the seeds of all life, even before life had begun. She was not merely the ground beneath one's feet. She was the mother of mountains, the breast of the world, the body upon which all gods and men would one day stand. Next came Tartarus, not a god of torment, but the personification of a place, a deep, shadowed abyss far beneath even Gaia. Tartarus was not just a location, but a deity in its own right, the darkness that sleeps beneath all things. In later myth, Tartarus would become a prison for gods and monsters alike, but in this primordial moment, it was simply the echo of chaos made denser, a darker mirror of the void. With Gaia below and Tartarus beneath, the cosmos had gained its first depth. But what of the sky? From chaos came also Uranus, the sky, vast and cold and starless. He was not simply above Gaia, he was her equal and her opposite. If she was soil and stone, he was breath and breeze, the dome of heaven itself. He stretched endlessly across her, and in time the two would join, earth and sky, in the first union of the cosmos. But creation did not only follow form. From chaos also came eros, love, and this was no accident. For in myth, love is the great catalyst. Eros was not the chubby cherub of later tales. He was a cosmic force, the very principle of attraction, of harmony, of unity. He did not shoot arrows, he pulled beings together. Without Eros, Gaia and Uranus might never have joined. Without Eros, there would have been no generation, only isolation. He was the thread that wove the universe together, not with romance, but with gravity. And from the void also emerged Nyx, the night, a figure of immense power and beauty. She cloaked the world in shadow, not as a punishment, but as a balance to what would come. Nyx was older than the gods, older than light. Even Zeus, king of Olympus, would one day fear her. She was mystery incarnate, both gentle and terrifying. The cool hush of evening and the dread that lurks in darkness were her domain. Her children would embody all that lives in twilight, sleep, dreams, fate, and death. These were not yet gods in the Olympian sense. They had no temples, no worshippers. They were truths made flesh, earth and sky, love and night, abyss and void. From them the world would slowly take shape, and though their tales are not as famous as those of Zeus or Athena, they are the roots from which all other myths grow. So now let us pause and imagine the world as it was then, a place not of silence but of new beginnings, the earth beneath your mind's feet, the sky stretching above, love threading between them. The night slowly falling, wrapping all in velvet stillness, and deep, deep below, Tartarus waiting, patient, eternal. This was the world before Olympus, before war, before men walked or gods quarrelled. This was the age of origin, and it had only just begun. In the dim ages after chaos, Gaia, the earth, stirred with power. She was not simply land, but life's first womb, pregnant with potential. The universe was still young, raw, unshaped, but Gaia, steady and fertile, began the first act of divine motherhood. From within herself, Gaia birthed Uranus, the sky. Some myths say he emerged to cover her entirely, a canopy of stars yet unlit, a dome stretching over her wide form. Others whisper he was born as both son and consort, a paradox of divine creation. Either way, the result was a union, earth below, sky above, locked in an eternal embrace. Together they formed the first cosmic marriage, not of love but of necessity. Gaia cradled life, and Uranus stretched protectively and possessively above her. This union bore fruit. From their bond came the Titans, 12 powerful beings who embodied the very elements and ideas of the cosmos, each one vast, ancient, and immortal. Among them were Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world, Hyperion, the Titan of light and father of the sun, moon, and dawn, Themis, goddess of divine law and natural order, Iapetus, forefather of mortality, Chaos of intellect and celestial knowledge, Crius, often linked with constellations and time, and of course Rhea and Mnemosyne, Tethys and Thea, goddesses of memory, motherhood and light. Last of the Titans was Cronus, the youngest, and one whose name would echo in dread and destiny. But Gaia's children did not end there. Her womb gave rise also to the Cyclopes, massive beings with a single blazing eye in the center of their foreheads. They were raw power, masters of the forge, the architects of lightning and thunder. And alongside them came the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, monstrous and mighty, each with 50 heads and 100 arms. They were chaos in muscle and bone, feared even by the gods who came after. Yet Gaia, ever generous, did not flinch at her children's form. She loved them all, divine or monstrous, beautiful or brutal. But Uranus did not. He looked upon the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires with revulsion. To him, they were not wonders, but threats, and so he acted. Uranus began his reign not with guidance, but with suppression. Every time Gaia bore a new child, he would cast them into the depths of Tartarus, imprisoning them in the dark belly of the earth, his own wife's body. He feared their power, feared the prophecy that his children would one day overthrow him. But he never stopped to ask why the prophecy existed in the first place. Gaia, the eternal mother, cried out in silent pain. She felt her children trapped within her, pressing against her depths, and she suffered. Her grief was not loud, but it was vast. The earth groaned beneath the weight of injustice, and in that groan something ancient awakened, resolve. She knew she could no longer bear this silently, and so Gaia turned not to weeping, but to vengeance. In secret, she shaped a sickle of adamantine, a curved blade forged from the bones of the earth itself, and one by one she approached her Titan sons, whispering to them not just of injustice but of rebellion. But fear lives long in the hearts of the powerful. Most of her sons refused. Uranus was the sky. How could they defy what stretched over all things? How could they fight what they could not escape? Only Cronus, the youngest, stepped forward, bold, ambitious, perhaps naive, but willing. He took the sickle from Gaia's hands and waited, hidden beneath her folds. And on a fated night, when Uranus descended to lie across the earth once more, Cronus leapt from hiding and struck. With one violent sweep, Cronus castrated Uranus, severing his power and casting his reign into blood and memory. The blood fell upon Gaia and gave birth to further beings. The Furies, spirits of vengeance, the giants, immense warriors of primal strength, and Aphrodite, born from the sea foam that rose around Uranus's severed flesh. Uranus, broken and dethroned, vanished from the surface world. His name would remain, but his rule was over, and thus the first divine succession was complete. But Gaia's heart did not rejoice. Her son had done what she asked, but he too would fall to the same curse of tyranny. For in the world of gods, power was never held for long. And in the silence after Uranus's scream, Gaia already feared what Cronus might become. With Uranus dethroned, Cronus stood victorious. The sickle, now slick with divine blood, hung at his side, a tool of liberation and yet a symbol of what he had become. His siblings, the Titans, emerged from the shadows, no longer caged in Gaia's depths. The Hecatoncheires and Cyclopes too were freed, but only briefly. For as the dust of rebellion settled, Cronus began to see threats where once he saw kin. Though he had freed the cosmos from the tyranny of Uranus, Cronus would not prove to be a kinder ruler. Perhaps he believed that to show mercy was to invite betrayal, or perhaps the echoes of his father's paranoia whispered now in his own heart. Whatever the reason, Cronus re-imprisoned the monstrous siblings, the hundred-handed ones and the Cyclopes, this time deeper in Tartarus, binding them in chains forged from fear and silence. He took the throne not in Olympus but on Mount Othrys, the seat of Titan power. His queen was Rhea, his sister, a Titaness of fertility, motherhood, and divine order. Together they presided over what would be called the Golden Age, an era of peace for mortals, but a reign built on tension among the gods. Cronus had brought a new order to the cosmos. The stars turned, the oceans flowed, the earth ripened. Mankind, in its early, innocent state, thrived under the golden skies. But even in paradise, seeds of doom were already planted. You see, before Uranus fell, he uttered a prophecy that Cronus too would be overthrown by his own child. The curse of succession, once invoked, could not be undone, and Cronus, who had once wielded the sickle with the boldness of youth, now found himself gripped by the same dread that had haunted his father. When Rhea bore their first child, Hestia, goddess of the hearth, Cronus did not gaze upon her with joy. Instead, his mind returned to the prophecy, sharp and gnawing. He saw in the child not hope, but threat. And so, with a coldness sharpened by fear, he swallowed her whole, not in malice, but in desperate self-preservation. Down into his belly she went, not to be digested, for gods cannot die so easily, but imprisoned in a living tomb of silence and shadow. Rhea, heartbroken, watched as this repeated with each child. Demeter, goddess of grain and fertility, followed. Then Hera, proud and vengeful. Then Hades, ruler-to-be of the underworld. And Poseidon, lord of future seas. 5 children, each with a destiny, now lost within the belly of a paranoid king. But Gaia watched too, and the earth remembers. She had seen this pattern before, she had suffered it before, and so once again the whisper of rebellion passed between mother and daughter. This time it was Rhea who would act. When her 6th child was born, she could not bear to watch another fate swallowed. This child, Zeus, was born in secret, not upon Mount Othrys, but in the dark heart of Crete, hidden among nymphs and cave songs. Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes, presented it to Cronus, and watched him consume it, never suspecting the deceit. Zeus was raised in shadow and secrecy, fed by divine milk, his cries drowned out by the clashing of sacred shields, beaten endlessly by his guardians to mask his presence from the ears of Olympus. And as he grew, so too did the storm within him, not just of strength, but of purpose. Cronus's reign continued, unknowingly marked for its own end. He sat upon his throne, surrounded by hollow triumphs, unaware that the first cycle of succession had not ended, but merely paused. And the sickle, the very symbol of his rise, would soon pass into a new hand, one destined not just to overthrow a tyrant, but to reshape the heavens entirely. The Age of Titans. The world turns beneath Titan feet, and for a moment in cosmic time, the sky is still. The rule of Cronus begins, not as a storm, but as a heavy silence. After Uranus was cast down, the sky no longer wept with pain, but the air did not sing with joy either. In the vast space between Earth and stars, a new power rose. Cronus, now the ruler of all creation. With the sickle now buried, symbolic or hidden, his reign began not in blood, but in cautious control. Cronus had not won alone. The overthrow of Uranus was a family act, a rebellion born of Gaia and executed by the children she bore. These children were the Titans, the elder gods, born of earth and sky themselves. Each one embodied a fundamental force of nature or existence, and under Cronus's reign they became the architects of the universe's order. There were 12 original Titans, 6 male and 6 female, but a few stood as pillars among them. Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world, was not a sea god in the later sense, but a cosmic boundary, the outermost edge of the known universe. He flowed beyond what the eye could see, separating the world of mortals from the mysteries of the deep. He did not take sides in the future wars of gods. He was old, wise, and patient, content to flow and observe. Hyperion, the Titan of heavenly light, fathered the sun, the moon, and the dawn through his children Helios, Selene, and Eos. He was the light before Apollo, the flame before Olympus. His presence gave the world its first sense of direction, east and west, day and night, beginning and end. Rhea, sister and queen of Cronus, was the gentler force, motherhood, fertility, and the cycle of birth. But though she ruled beside Cronus, her role would become far more painful than powerful, as we have seen. Iapetus, the Titan of mortal life and craftsmanship, fathered 4 sons, each destined for tragedy or transformation. Atlas, who would carry the heavens. Prometheus, who would gift fire and suffer for it. Epimetheus, the after-thinker whose carelessness let loose Pandora's box. And Menoetius, who would fall in wrath. And then there was Themis, Titaness of divine law and order. From her came the sacred ideas of justice and balance, the moral compass of gods and men alike. She was not fierce, but firm, a reminder that the cosmos must obey more than just the will of the strong. Together, these Titans ruled in what later poets called the Golden Age, a time before war, before cruelty, before humankind had even tasted struggle. In this age, mortals walked the earth without fear. The seasons were gentle, and the fruits of the earth came freely. No need for toil, no need for law, for the world still young was full of promise. Yet this harmony was deceptive. Cronus's rule was built not on balance but on avoidance. He feared the future, he feared his children, and so, as they were born, he swallowed them, not to kill, but to cage. Still, the universe breathed. The stars moved, drawn by Hyperion's light. The rivers flowed, Oceanus steady and eternal. The cycles of time turned under Rhea's quiet guidance. Prometheus, bold and curious, began shaping clay figures with careful hands. Themis whispered the first laws into the wind, and Iapetus watched his sons grow too daring. But behind the beauty of this age was a gathering unease. A prophecy still hung in the air that Cronus, like Uranus before him, would fall by the hand of his own child. The Titans may have ruled the cosmos, but they could not silence fate, and fate was already stirring. In a distant cave on the island of Crete, a child cried softly, the 6th son of Cronus, hidden from his father's hunger. His name was Zeus, and the future trembled in his breath. In the golden haze of the Titan Age, as rivers circled the earth and the stars rose without fear, something darker began to take root beneath the peace, the slow corrosion of fear hidden within the heart of Cronus himself. Though the Titans ruled the cosmos in apparent balance, Cronus was not at peace. He knew what he had done to his father. And he knew what had been foretold, that he too would be overthrown by his own child, just as he had overthrown Uranus. Prophecy in the world of myth is not a distant warning. It is a slow-burning certainty, and Cronus, god or not, could not escape the whisper of fate. He married his sister Rhea, the Earth Mother of the next generation, a goddess of nurture, of continuity, of quiet strength. Their union, though divine, was not spared from fear's shadow. One by one Rhea gave birth to children, and one by one Cronus devoured them. First came Hestia, the gentle goddess of the hearth, swallowed whole before she could cry. Then Demeter, bringer of grain and seasons, her promise of fertility extinguished in an instant. Then Hera, proud and radiant, who would one day wear the crown of queen, but not yet. Then came Hades, whose destiny lay in shadows and silent gates, and Poseidon, the storm beneath the sea, taken before he could taste salt air. Each time Rhea held the infant to her chest for a breath, a heartbeat, and then lost them to the terrible mouth of time itself. For Cronus devoured not out of hate, but out of terror, the terror of losing power, of being undone, of the prophecy inching closer with each birth. But after the fifth child, something broke in Rhea. Her grief, once quiet, grew heavy. Her sorrow curdled into determination. She would not lose another child, not to fate, not to fear, not to the cold, devouring silence that Cronus had become. And so, when she became pregnant a sixth time, Rhea did something bold. She sought counsel from Gaia, her mother, the earth itself, and together they made a plan. When the time came to give birth, Rhea did not stay in the palace of the Titans. Instead, she traveled in secret to the island of Crete, where a hidden cave waited deep in the mountains, away from the eyes of Cronus and the ears of the stars. There, in the hush of stone and shadow, she gave birth to her sixth child, a boy. His name was Zeus. She wrapped him not in silk or royal linens, but in silence and promise. The baby did not wail. He blinked, breathed, and watched the world begin. Rhea left him in the care of nurturing nymphs, who would raise him on honey and milk from the sacred goat Amalthea. The Curetes, armed dancers loyal to Rhea, guarded the cave, clashing their spears against their shields to drown out the baby's cries and keep Cronus unaware. Meanwhile, to deceive her husband, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and brought it to Cronus, hands trembling, voice steady. Without a second thought, he swallowed it whole, believing he had averted fate once again. But fate had already begun to turn. The hidden child grew in secret, not just in body, but in purpose. Zeus would learn not only the strength of gods, but the cunning of mortals. He would be taught not only thunder and lightning, but patience, justice, and revenge. For while the world above seemed unchanged, the balance of power had begun to shift. Cronus, ever vigilant, had swallowed 5 of his children and a stone, but he had also swallowed his future downfall, the illusion of control. And far away, in a mountain cave bathed in shadow and the hum of prophecy, the god who would change the world was quietly learning to stand. For a time, the Titans ruled the cosmos in majestic harmony, or so it seemed from afar. Their golden age shone from the heights of Mount Othrys, a great and sacred peak that stood as the counterpart to what would one day become Mount Olympus. From this lofty throne, Cronus, the king of the Titans, presided over the universe with a seemingly steady hand. Mount Othrys was more than just a mountain. It was a symbol of order, of divine hierarchy in its earliest form. The Titans, ancient and elemental, spread across the cosmos. Oceanus governed the endless rivers that encircled the earth. Hyperion, the Titan of light, watched over the sun, moon, and dawn. Iapetus fathered progeny who would one day touch both glory and doom. Themis, Titaness of law, held the delicate threads of justice and order. And Mnemosyne, mother of the Muses, ensured that memory, and thus story, would endure. Among them, Rhea, Queen of the Titans, wore her grief like a cloak of silence, still haunted by the loss of 5 children to Cronus's paranoia. Yet she moved through the halls of Mount Othrys with grace, her secret of Zeus's survival locked tightly within her. And so the Titans ruled, vast and powerful, each a pillar of the cosmos. The rivers flowed, the stars wheeled overhead in precise harmony. Time stretched on in golden silence. But beneath that glittering veneer something stirred. The world, still young, still forming, was not a still pond, but a churning sea. And while the Titans sat upon their thrones, the unspoken fear of succession, once wielded by Cronus against Uranus and now gnawing at his own soul, began to ripple through the air. Prophecy, always patient, never forgot its course. There were whispers, barely audible, that Cronus was not the eternal king he imagined himself to be, that somewhere out beyond the edges of his sight a child lived, a son, one he had not swallowed, one who would rise. The Titans felt it too, not all, but enough. Even as their rule seemed unshakable, the air around Mount Othrys thickened with omen, birds circled strangely, dreams twisted. The earth herself trembled in brief, inexplicable moments, not from rage but from anticipation. Cronus, in his hall of stone and storm, grew more restless by the year. He sought reassurance, more sacrifices, more power. But power, when hoarded out of fear, begins to rot. He became suspicious of his siblings, then of Rhea. He ruled not as a father of gods, but as a sentinel over his own downfall. Meanwhile, far from Othrys, in a hidden cave on the island of Crete, Zeus grew strong. Each day he watched the sky and listened to the murmurs of nymphs and beasts. He heard stories of his lost siblings, of Cronus's betrayal, of a world out of balance. The nymphs told him not only of thunder but of justice, that power could be used not to dominate but to restore. And high atop Mount Othrys the wind changed. The golden age of the Titans, though outwardly unmarred, had begun to fray. Tension, unseen but undeniable, crept through its columns and courts like ivy through stone. It was not loud, not yet, but the silence was no longer comforting. It was waiting, for Cronus had swallowed his children to preserve his throne, but prophecy had already begun to climb the mountain, and the boy in the cave was learning to roar. The Titanomachy, the war of the gods, part Bedtime, the hidden sun and the children of Cronus. Far from the shadow of Mount Othrys, on the verdant slopes of Mount Ida in Crete, a child grew in secret. Hidden in a sacred cave by his mother Rhea, the infant Zeus was tended by nymphs, divine spirits of nature, whose lullabies were woven from streams, wind, and leaves. To mask his cries, the Curetes, armoured dancers, clashed their spears on shields, drowning the sound in warlike rhythm, so that Cronus might never hear it echo across the cosmos. The nymphs, Adrastia and Ida, chief among them, nursed the infant with the milk of the divine goat Amalthea, and hung his cradle from a tree so that he touched neither earth, sky, nor sea, the domains Cronus watched most closely. And thus, under the soft canopy of divine protection, Zeus grew in strength, in cunning, and in destiny. He did not grow up with hatred in his heart, but with justice in his bones. The stories whispered by nymphs were not just lullabies, but memories of a world thrown out of harmony. He learned that he was the sixth child of Cronus, and that his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, had been devoured not out of hunger but fear, fear of prophecy, fear of change. And so, when the time came, Zeus did not rise in rage. He rose with purpose. Guided by Gaia's wisdom and the quiet encouragement of Rhea, Zeus descended from his sanctuary and approached the halls of Cronus, not with brute force, but with strategy. Some tales say he disguised himself as a cupbearer and served his father a potion crafted by Metis, the goddess of cleverness and thought. Others speak of confrontation and force, but in all versions the outcome is the same. Cronus vomited up the 5 children he had swallowed, full-grown and radiant. The gods and goddesses who had slumbered in the shadows of his stomach were returned to the world. First came Hestia, serene and centered, guardian of the hearth. Then Demeter, fertile and wise, bringer of grain. Hera, proud and fierce, the future queen of Olympus. Hades, shadowed and solemn, lord of hidden things. And Poseidon, vast and deep, bearer of the sea's fury. For the first time the Olympians stood together, siblings reborn, united by fate and injustice. They looked upon the world ruled by Titans and saw not order, but tyranny. And from that moment the war began. A war that would shake the very bones of the earth. It was not swift, it was not simple, but it was inevitable. The Titanomachy, they would call it. A war not just between generations of gods, but between 2 visions of what power should be, fear and domination, or balance and renewal. And at its center stood Zeus, not merely a son reclaiming a throne, but a force awakened, ready to challenge the cosmos itself. And so it began, a war not of mortals but of gods, where time itself seemed to pause and tremble. The Titanomachy, as it would later be called, spanned 10 years, a full decade of thunder and flame, shadow and skyfire. It was not a skirmish, not a single clash, but a long, grinding cosmic siege fought between 2 generations of divine power. On one side stood the Titans, the children of Gaia and Uranus, ancient and immense. Led by Cronus, their ranks included Iapetus, master of craftsmanship, Chios, whose eyes saw deeply into the heavens, and Hyperion, bearer of celestial fire. They held their fortress on Mount Othrys, a peak older than memory, grim and unmoving. On the other side rose the Olympians, young gods with the energy of a rising world. Zeus, now fully awakened, stood at their helm, wielding a courage sharpened by injustice. Beside him, Hera, poised and commanding, Poseidon, whose moods mirrored the sea's storms, Hades, keeper of the unseen, Demeter with her quiet strength, and Hestia, whose calm center anchored them all. Though younger and fewer in number, their resolve was unbreakable. The war shattered the skies. The very ground split with each clash. Rivers reversed, forests burned, mountains fell into themselves. Thunder became a language, and storms became prayers. But the Olympians knew they could not win by strength alone. The Titans were vast and enduring, steeped in an older power. So Zeus turned to allies forgotten and forsaken, those buried by fear and time. From deep within the bowels of Tartarus, where Cronus had once imprisoned his own monstrous kin, Zeus descended with bravery and cunning. There, in the eternal gloom, he found the Cyclopes, towering, one-eyed beings of incredible skill, once cast into darkness for their terrifying appearance. Grateful for their freedom, the Cyclopes pledged loyalty to Zeus, and more than that, they offered gifts, tools that would change the war and the world. To Zeus they gave the lightning bolt, a weapon of piercing skyfire, unmatched in swiftness or fury. To Poseidon they forged the trident, a three-pronged spear that could shake oceans and raise tsunamis. And to Hades they crafted the helm of invisibility, a shadowed crown that allowed its wearer to pass unseen through both battle and underworld. But Zeus did not stop there. Deeper still in Tartarus, beneath chains older than stone, lay the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones. Each with 50 heads and 100 arms, these giants had been bound in terror, for their sheer force frightened even the Titans who once ruled them. With words not of command but of respect, Zeus freed them, and the 100-handed ones rose like living earthquakes. With them now stood Briareus, Cottus, and Gyges, each a whirlwind of fury. When they entered the battlefield, mountains became missiles, torn from the earth and hurled toward Othrys. Their roars were thunder, their movements hurricanes. The Titans, who had once bound them, now faced the wrath of what they had buried. The war turned. Where once the Olympians had held the line with desperation, now they pushed forward, emboldened by the gifts of the Cyclops and the might of the 100-handed ones. Each battle shook the heavens. Atlas, the mighty Titan, fought with unrelenting force, while Zeus's bolts split the sky in arcs of gold and fire. For 10 years the war surged like a fever, but the tide was turning, and with each clash Zeus grew stronger, not just in power but in conviction. He was not merely fighting for vengeance. He was fighting for the world to be reborn, and that rebirth would come with the fall of the Titans. But the end was still to come, in fire, stone, and an ancient prison deep beneath the earth. The 10th year of war dawned with an eerie stillness. The clouds above Mount Othrys hung low and bruised, as though the sky itself held its breath. The Titans, once sure of their eternal dominion, now looked across the battlefield with weariness. Their forces were faltering. The 100-handed ones hurled mountain after mountain into their defences. Zeus's lightning bolts flashed like divine anger given form. The end, though unspoken, crept closer with each passing day. And then, in one final decisive clash, the Olympians surged forward. Zeus, now fully embracing his role as a commander of gods and storms, unleashed a tempest so great it split the world open. Lightning arced through the Titan's stronghold, igniting fires across the landscape. Poseidon, with his trident, called forth earthquakes and tidal waves that tore through the mountains of Othrys. Hades, invisible under his helm of darkness, moved like a silent judgment, sowing chaos among the enemy ranks, and in the center of it all stood Cronus, still mighty, still defiant, his sickle gleaming with the blood of a previous age. But even he could not withstand the onslaught of gods and freed monsters united under Zeus's banner. In a climactic moment, Zeus faced Cronus, not as a son pleading for acceptance, but as the next chapter of existence. The battle between them was fierce, shaking the firmament itself. But Zeus prevailed, not just by force, but through strategy and will. The sickle that had once castrated Uranus fell to the ground, lifeless. Cronus, the devourer of his own children, had finally been overthrown by one who refused to be swallowed. The Titans were defeated. As retribution, Zeus cast the most rebellious of the Titans into Tartarus, the same abyss where they had once imprisoned the 100-handed ones. With chains forged by necessity and guarded by monsters older than time, the Titans were locked away in the deepest darkness of the world, where their moans would never again reach the surface. Only a few Titans were spared. Those who had remained neutral or aided the Olympians, such as Themis and Mnemosyne, were honored rather than punished. Even in victory, Zeus knew the importance of balance. With the Titans gone, the cosmos stood still, like a calm after a cosmic storm. And in that stillness, something new was born, Olympus. Perched atop a mountain that seemed to touch the heavens, Mount Olympus became the home of the new divine order. No longer did gods rule from shadows or fear. Olympus was a place of light, of power, of storytelling. It was a realm above the clouds where gods lived, not hidden from mortals, but mirrored in their myths, in every thunderclap and sunbeam. Zeus, now crowned king of the gods, took his throne with a quiet gravity. He divided the world not for conquest but for order. Zeus would rule the sky where storms and justice resided. Poseidon would claim the sea with its ever-changing moods and unfathomable depths. Hades, ever solemn, accepted the underworld, guarding the dead and keeping the balance of life. This division of the cosmos was not an end, but a beginning, the dawn of a new pantheon, where gods would reflect the passions, flaws, and hopes of humanity itself. And so the Titanomachy ended not just with a battle won, but with a world reshaped. The ancient order was gone. A new era had begun, one that would echo through every myth, every prayer, every quiet whisper under the stars. Olympus stood high, but its gods would soon descend, into love, into wrath, into stories that would never sleep. The Rise of Mount Olympus, Part 1, A New Order in the Cosmos. When the last thunder of war rolled into silence and the Titans were bound in the darkness of Tartarus, a strange calm settled over the world. The skies, so often split by lightning, now turned serene. The seas no longer boiled with rage. The deep earth, once shuddering from battle, began to breathe again. From this stillness emerged something profound, not merely peace but order. A new world was to be built atop the ruins of the old, and it would begin not with mortals, but with gods. The division of the cosmos was one of Zeus's first acts as king of the gods. Though he had claimed victory, he did not claim all. Instead, he understood that power, to last, must be shared. With solemn ceremony, the three brothers, born of Rhea and Cronus, cast lots to decide their dominions. Zeus, the youngest, yet now the most powerful, drew the sky. He became the ruler of storms, clouds, lightning, and the great dome of the heavens. It was he who would sit upon the throne of Olympus, watching over gods and mortals alike. Poseidon, wild-eyed and tempest-hearted, took the sea. With his trident he would stir the oceans, summon tsunamis and command sea beasts. But he was not merely chaos, he was also the god of calm waters, of tides and harbours, of the rhythm of waves. Hades, grim and still, accepted the underworld. He did not protest, nor seek glory. In the quiet depth of his realm, he would rule over the dead, not as a jailer, but as a keeper of balance. The living and the dead would each have their place, and Hades would ensure it remained so. Thus the cosmic trinity was formed, sky, sea, and underworld, each realm with its own king, its own secrets, and its own weight. But a kingdom is never ruled by one voice alone. With Zeus's reign began the rise of a broader divine order, one that would shape the mythic age and fill the halls of Mount Olympus with the music of immortal lives. Hera, sister and soon queen, stood at Zeus's side. Regal, proud and unyielding, Hera was the goddess of marriage, fidelity, and the sacred bonds of family. Her presence brought structure and accountability to Olympus, even if her heart often wrestled with Zeus's wayward passions. Demeter, serene and powerful, took her place as the goddess of agriculture, grain, and the harvest. From her, the earth would yield wheat and fruit, and the cycles of the seasons would begin. Though her gaze often drifted to the mortal world, where crops rose and fell with the sun, she remained ever loyal to the new divine order. Hestia, the gentle guardian of hearth and home, brought warmth to Olympus, not the fire of destruction, but the fire that flickers in every sanctuary and dwelling. Her domain was the home itself, the sacred center of both divine and human life. While she was the least dramatic of the gods, her importance was constant and sacred. And then came the new gods, those who had not yet taken part in the Titanomachy, but whose names would echo just as loudly. Athena, born not from the womb but from Zeus's own forehead, emerged fully armored, radiant with wisdom and battlecraft. She would become the goddess of strategy, of cities, of reasoned war and civic order. In her, the Olympians found a balance between intellect and strength. Apollo, the god of light, music, healing and prophecy, stood as a golden symbol of harmony. Twin to Artemis, his presence brought clarity, not only in vision but in truth. At Delphi his oracles would shape destinies. Through his lyre he would soothe even the mightiest wrath. Artemis, wild and silver as moonlight, took dominion over the hunt, over animals, over virgin forests and moonlit paths. Fiercely independent, she protected maidens and animals alike, embodying both purity and untamed wilderness. With these gods, and others soon to rise, Mount Olympus began to pulse with purpose. It was not a palace of marble and gold, but a living mythic court where each god represented a force of the world and a reflection of the human heart. They quarreled, they loved, they judged, they created. And always above them loomed Olympus itself, not merely a place but a symbol of the divine order, of the eternal reach of stories, of the mountain that touches both heaven and earth. And so the world had changed again, not through war this time, but through the weaving of roles of meaning, of myths. The age of Titans had ended, and in its place had risen a pantheon that would shape the imaginations of poets, painters, and dreamers for thousands of years to come. As the divine order of Olympus settled into its newfound harmony, not all beings were content to simply obey. Beneath the calm surface of Mount Olympus stirred ancient pride, daring defiance, and the quiet rumble of rebellion, not in the form of war, but in the form of compassion. And at the heart of this storm stood Prometheus. Prometheus was a Titan, but not one cast into Tartarus during the war. He had sided with Zeus, helping the Olympians defeat his own kin. But Prometheus was different, clever, forward-thinking, and above all, deeply invested in the fate of a new creation that the gods had only just begun to toy with: humanity. The gods, particularly Zeus, had crafted mortals, fragile, brief and fumbling. While the divine basked in ambrosia and golden halls, humans toiled cold and hungry on the earth below. They huddled in caves, ignorant of the arts, exposed to the night's bitter breath. Zeus, ever watchful, had withheld fire from them, not just literal warmth, but symbolic power, fire as illumination, knowledge, independence. But Prometheus loved humankind. He had shaped them from clay with his own hands and could not bear to see them suffer. And so in secret, under the shroud of a moonless night, Prometheus stole fire from Olympus. He did not simply hand them a flame, he handed them the spark of civilization. With fire, humans cooked food, forged tools, kept wild beasts at bay, and eventually built cities. From this act of rebellion bloomed 1,000 golden possibilities. It was the first myth of divine defiance in the name of compassion, but gods, especially Zeus, do not forgive such trespasses lightly. When Zeus learned what Prometheus had done, his wrath was legendary. He ordered Prometheus chained to a rock, not for a year or a century, but for eternity. Each day, an eagle, savage and tireless, would descend upon him and devour his liver. Each night, it would regenerate. The punishment was as poetic as it was cruel, an endless loop of suffering for the crime of empathy. Yet Prometheus, even in agony, did not cry out for mercy. His torment became a symbol, the price paid for knowledge, the cost of rebellion, and the sacred pain of standing with the weak against the mighty. But Zeus was not finished. If Prometheus's crime had been to give too much, Zeus would now ensure mortals received something they didn't ask for. And so he created Pandora. The myths differ slightly in detail, but most agree. Pandora was the first woman, crafted by the gods not in malice, but in exquisite, fatal beauty. Each god contributed to her making. Aphrodite gave her grace, Hermes gave her cunning, Athena taught her crafts, and Zeus gave her curiosity. And with her, the gods sent a box, or more precisely a jar, with one instruction: do not open it. But how could one gifted with curiosity resist? Pandora, placed among humans, lived a brief span of wonder and joy, but each day the box whispered to her, not with sound, but with promise, the promise of answers, the allure of secrets, the weight of mystery. At last she lifted the lid, and in that moment suffering was born. Out of the jar flew plague and famine, envy and grief, madness and death, every sorrow that now shadows the mortal world. Once loose, they could not be recaptured. The earth darkened, hearts grew heavy, and pain took root in the lives of humankind. But as the jar emptied and Pandora wept over what she had done, one final thing remained at the bottom: Elpis, hope. Hope did not flee with the others. Whether that was Zeus's mercy or a trick of the gods remains debated by philosophers and poets. But it remained, fragile, glowing faintly in the darkness, the one thing mortals could cling to, even as the world bruised them with time and trial. These early myths of divine pride, of Prometheus's generosity and Pandora's curiosity, mark the turning point in the relationship between gods and mortals. No longer were humans mere spectators of divine drama. They were participants, victims and inheritors of the choices made on Olympus. And through these stories, the Greeks explained not only why suffering existed, but how agency, rebellion and hope intertwined. The gods were not perfect. They were powerful, yes, but flawed, emotional and deeply human in their passions. In these contradictions, Greek mythology found its richness, not in presenting a world of moral clarity, but in echoing the complicated, painful beauty of life itself. And so the fire burned, both a gift and a curse. The box lay open, its shadows free. And somewhere, in the hands of a weary mortal, hope still glowed, waiting to be believed in. By now, the cosmos had taken form. Olympus stood proud above the clouds. The sea churned under Poseidon's restless gaze, and the underworld echoed with Hades's quiet authority. The Titans had been chained, the fires of rebellion quelled, and Zeus sat atop the world, thunderbolt in hand, ever watchful, ever wary. But the world of gods was no longer isolated. With fire in their hands and suffering in their bones, humans had arrived fully into the mythic narrative, not as background figures, but as participants in a delicate, often dangerous relationship with their creators. The foundation of mortal-divine interaction was being set, and it was built on both reverence and risk. The Greeks believed the gods were not distant deities gazing indifferently from afar. No, the Olympians watched, judged, loved, and punished. The boundaries between divine and human were porous. Heroes were born from unions between gods and mortals. Dreams were seen as messages, natural disasters as punishments, boons and blessings as signs of favor. Life was a dialogue with the divine, unpredictable and personal. This relationship was transactional, yet deeply spiritual. Mortals gave offerings, libations, burnt sacrifices, prayers at dawn. In return, the gods gave rain for crops, victory in war, fertility, safety, or simply the absence of wrath. But when humans erred, through pride, neglect, or offense, the gods struck back. The message was clear: to live a good life meant to recognize the gods' power, honor them, and know your place in the grand order of things. Among the most feared offences was hubris, the dangerous overstepping of one's mortal bounds. To challenge or insult the gods was to invite ruin. The myth of Niobe, for instance, became a cautionary tale. Proud of her many children, Niobe mocked the goddess Leto, who had only two, Apollo and Artemis. In divine retaliation, her children were slain, and she was turned to stone, eternally weeping. Her pride became a monument to grief. And then there was Arachne, a mortal weaver so skilled that she dared to boast she could surpass Athena herself. When the goddess challenged her to a contest, Arachne's tapestry was flawless, but filled with scenes mocking the gods. Though impressed, Athena was enraged. Arachne was transformed into a spider, doomed to weave forever, her legacy tangled in silk and warning. These myths reveal more than punishment. They reflect the moral structure of ancient Greek life. Piety, moderation, gratitude. These were not just virtues, but survival strategies. One did not simply live among the gods, one had to navigate them. But the divine was not only punitive. There were gods of healing, music, love, and harvest, and they reached into mortal lives with compassion as well. Demeter mourned the loss of her daughter Persephone, taken by Hades, and in her grief the earth withered. But the resolution, Persephone's return for part of the year, brought back the seasons, a divine compromise rooted in maternal love. In this myth, we see that gods too could feel deeply. They were relatable in their passions, even as they remained terrifying in power. Rituals became a way for mortals to engage the divine. Each city had its patron god, Athena for Athens, Apollo for Delphi, Artemis for Ephesus, and temples rose like stone prayers, adorned with offerings, guarded by priests and priestesses. Festivals like the Eleusinian Mysteries honored the gods with music, processions, and sacred rites that drew thousands. In these moments, the line between human and God blurred, and the collective imagination carried the people into myth. Yet for all the reverence, the Greeks never blindly worshipped. Their myths were filled with questions, contradictions, and moments of irony. They portrayed their gods with flaws. Zeus was unfaithful, Hera vengeful, Dionysus chaotic. But in doing so, they acknowledged a deeper truth. Power does not always equal virtue, and the gods, like life, could be unpredictable. This duality, awe and skepticism, worship and warning, formed the bedrock of the mortal-divine relationship. To the Greeks, myth was not doctrine. It was a mirror held to human nature, magnified by divine light. It explained storms and earthquakes, yes, but also love, ambition, grief, and guilt. The gods were cosmic forces, but also reflections of humanity itself. Thus, as Mount Olympus rose above the mortal world, so too did a bridge, invisible yet ever present, between the finite and the eternal. Mortals did not merely believe in the gods, they lived with them. In every fire lit, every oath sworn, every grain harvested, and every funeral tare. And in that sacred exchange, the first deep chords of mythic meaning were struck, chords that would echo through philosophy, drama, poetry, and faith for centuries to come. The Gigantomachy and Cosmic Rebellion, Part 1, Gaia's Wrath and the Rise of the Giants. After the thunderous victory of Zeus and the Olympians in the Titanomachy, peace seemed to settle across the cosmos. The Titans were cast into Tartarus, their roars silenced by the weight of chains forged by divine hands. Mount Olympus stood tall, a beacon of the new divine order. Yet beneath the surface of this tranquil reign, an ancient rage was stirring, deep within the very earth itself. Gaia, Mother Earth, the ancient one from whom all had sprung, was not at peace. Though she had once aided her grandson Zeus in overthrowing Uranus and then Cronus, she now seethed with grief and fury. Her children, the Titans, were bound in torment in the deepest part of the abyss. Tartarus, her other child and consort, had become a prison rather than a primordial being. The cries of her Titan sons echoed into her roots, and Gaia's maternal fury bloomed into vengeance. In her rage, Gaia took to creation once more, but this time her children were not beings of balance or beauty. They were monsters of chaos and raw might, the Gigantes, or giants. Born from the spilled blood of Uranus when Cronus had castrated him, they were a twisted echo of the divine. Massive, wild, and nearly indestructible, these beings rose from the earth clad in serpentine legs and eyes that burned with ancient hatred. Unlike the Titans, the giants were not distant and regal. They were primal forces, creatures of the earth's fury, immune to old rules and uncaring for divine order. Gaia whispered into their ears of injustice and revenge. She urged them to rise up, to climb Olympus, and to tear down the new gods who had so casually cast her children into oblivion. And so began the Gigantomachy, the war of the giants. The battle did not erupt all at once. It began with omens, strange shifts in nature, stars falling from the sky, the ground trembling beneath sacred groves. The Olympians sensed the change. They had grown comfortable in their reign, seated on thrones of cloud and marble, their might undisputed. But now something old and terrible was rising. Gaia's new children were coming not as challengers but as avengers, led by their mightiest warriors, Alcyoneus, who could not be killed on his native soil, and Porphyrion, a giant filled with lust and fury. The giants surged upward. They hurled mountains, uprooted forests, and lashed out with weapons forged in volcanic fire. The skies darkened as chaos bloomed once more. The Olympians, caught off guard, fought back. Zeus hurled lightning bolts, setting the sky ablaze. Poseidon shattered the earth with his trident, creating new seas in his rage. Athena, the strategist, fought with calm precision, hurling islands like spears and decapitating giants with her shining blade. Apollo's arrows found their marks like threads through fate, while Artemis hunted the beasts that dared breach the forests of Olympus. Yet the giants were not easily defeated. Some were invulnerable, and others fought with a fury that even Ares admired. Gaia had ensured their power was unlike anything the gods had faced before. It was said that the Olympians could not defeat them alone, that only a mortal's aid would tip the scales. And so Zeus summoned Heracles, the demigod son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene. A man with the strength of gods but the fate of mortals, Heracles became the bridge between two worlds. With his bow and club, he entered the fray, side by side with deities who once looked down upon mortals. In Heracles' arrival, we see a shift, a moment where gods must rely on human valor. He was the key to the prophecy. Only with the aid of a mortal could the giants fall. Together, the Olympians and Heracles began to turn the tide. Heracles shot Alcyoneus with an arrow dipped in Hydra's poison, and when the giant fell but rose again on his homeland, Heracles dragged him away and finished the task elsewhere. Athena crushed Enceladus beneath the island of Sicily. Dionysus, in a rare moment of wrath, struck down Eurytus in a wine-fueled frenzy. Even Hephaestus joined in, hurling molten metal from his forge. Porphyrion, the greatest of the giants, made a final desperate charge toward Hera, filled with lust and violence. But Zeus blasted him with a bolt, and Heracles' arrow pierced his heart. And so, after a war that split mountains and boiled seas, the Gigantomachy ended. But the scars remained. The fields where giants fell became cursed. Volcanoes, the Greeks believed, were signs of giants still buried, their rage bubbling beneath the surface. Earthquakes were Gaia's sobs, tremors of her endless mourning. This war, more than the Titanomachy, marked the Olympians as cosmic rulers, for they had not just defeated their predecessors but defended their rule from primal rebellion. And it signaled something else, too, that mortals and gods would forever be entwined, that human hands, guided by divine will, could shape the fate of the cosmos. And in the quiet that followed the battle, Olympus stood taller than before, not only the home of gods, but the center of a universe hard won through storm, blood, and the reluctant unity of earth and sky. In the wake of chaos, when the earth cracked and Olympus shook, it was not only the divine who stood against the storm, it was also the mortal born. And in that moment, a new chapter was written in the language of myth. The gods were no longer alone in shaping fate. Heracles, the mortal son of Zeus, entered the fray, and with him the boundary between human and divine blurred forever. Heracles had already become a figure of legend even before the War of the Giants. Born of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, he was neither fully man nor fully god. He had known pain, endured labors, and walked through both glory and grief. Unlike the Olympians, he bled, hungered, wept. And yet within him pulsed the might of a storm, strength divine and unmatched by any mortal before or after. The prophecy was clear. The Olympians could not defeat the giants without the aid of a mortal. It was a clever design of fate, perhaps Gaia's final attempt to protect her children. For even the gods, with all their thunder and fury, could not undo what was meant to be undone by both divine judgment and human resolve. And so Zeus called upon Heracles, not as a subject, but as an ally. Together they ascended the battlefield, Olympus at their backs, the churning world ahead. As the Gigantomachy reached its climax, Heracles' role became pivotal. With a bow strung with lion sinew, he struck Alcyoneus, the invincible giant. Though the arrow pierced true, the giant did not fall. It was said he could not be killed on his homeland, so Heracles, wise in war, dragged him from the plains of Pallene and on foreign soil, struck again. This time the giant fell, unmoving, unmourned. One by one, Heracles helped tip the balance. Ephialtes, who had challenged both Apollo and Artemis, was struck by arrows in each eye, one gods, one mortals. Porphyrion, who in his fury had torn trees from the roots and tried to violate Hera, was halted mid-rage by Zeus's bolt, then felled by Heracles's poisoned shaft. The giant Enceladus, who tried to flee, was pinned beneath Sicily by Athena, the very earth sealing his defeat. His fiery breath, they said, still fueled Mount Etna's eruptions. The war was brutal, the sky wept fire, and the earth groaned with each fallen giant, but slowly, steadily, the tide turned, and when the last of Gaia's monstrous sons collapsed in a heap of stone and ash, the thunder ceased. The giants were defeated, but this victory was not merely martial, it was symbolic. The union of god and mortal in battle was no longer an accident, it was a necessity. Heracles's triumph among the gods marked the first moment that a mortal could stand beside Olympus, not below it. It was the beginning of the heroic age, where humans would not only be ruled by gods, but would shape myth with their own hands. With the threat of the giants buried deep, the world returned to stillness. Gaia, though sorrowful, didn't rise again. Even her grief could not match the exhaustion that followed the war. She withdrew, once again becoming silent earth, her vengeance spent. Zeus, high upon Olympus, surveyed what had been won, not just dominance, but legitimacy. The Gigantomachy was more than a battle. It was a second trial by fire for the new order of gods. If the Titanomachy had earned them the throne, the Gigantomachy earned them the right to keep it. And so, for the first time since the dawn of chaos, a kind of balance emerged. The Titans were buried, the giants silenced. The Olympians, weathered but unbeaten, ruled over sky, sea, and underworld. Mortals, once passive creatures of clay, had proven themselves capable of shaping destiny. It was not peace, exactly. The Greek world would never call such stillness peace. But it was a lull in the storm, a breath between battles, a moment where stars twinkled undisturbed and rivers ran without weeping. Zeus's rule, once contested, was now undeniable. His lightning was no longer a threat, but a symbol. The gods, despite their flaws and rivalries, had united in defense of their realm. They had relied not only on their might, but on the courage of a man, a mortal who, though not divine, had stood among them as an equal. And so, with thunder quiet and monsters buried, Olympus shone like a crown in the heavens, radiant, temporary, and entirely real. But the balance, as always, was fragile. The world had changed. Mortals had tasted myth, and the gods would soon discover that the price of power was not only war, but the constant vigilance of those who dream below. The trials of love and punishment, in the soft shadows between thunderous wars and heroic quests, lies a quieter, deeper mythology, one carved not in stone or fire, but in longing, heartbreak, and the consequences of pride. It is here that the Greek myths shift from the cosmic to the intimate, from the battles of gods to the trembling hearts of mortals. These stories whisper of the desires that define us, the punishments that haunt us, and the ever-fragile line between love and ruin. Among the most haunting tales is that of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was no warrior nor king, but a musician, born of Calliope the Muse, whose lyre could move the stars. His song stilled wild beasts, calmed the rage of rivers, and brought trees to lean in to listen. In Eurydice he found his heart's twin, gentle, bright, and beloved, but joy in Greek myth is rarely left untouched. On the day of their union, Eurydice stepped on a serpent and fell into the underworld, her life snatched away like a flame in wind. Devastated, Orpheus did what no man dared. He descended into Hades not with sword or shield, but with song. His music softened the hearts of even the Furies. Hades and Persephone, rulers of the dead, granted him a single chance. Eurydice could follow him back to the living world, so long as he never turned to look at her until they both reached the light. But near the threshold, just a breath from freedom, doubt overcame him. He turned, and with that single glance he lost her again, forever. His love defied death, but not his own fear. In another part of the mythic world lived Pygmalion, a sculptor who grew disillusioned with the flaws of mortal women. He turned his devotion to ivory and marble, carving a statue of impossible beauty, so perfect, so lifelike, that he fell in love with his creation. He dressed her, caressed her, whispered to her. She did not answer. Yet his longing grew so powerful that during the festival of Aphrodite he prayed not for love, but for life. Touched by the sincerity of his desire, the goddess granted his plea. When he returned and kissed the statue, her skin warmed, her breath stirred, and the marble woman, Galatea, opened her eyes. In that moment the chisel gave way to a heartbeat. Love had crossed from art into flesh, and longing became creation. But if love was a theme sung in soft notes, pride, hubris, roared louder and always drew the gods' wrath. Mortals who forgot their place in the cosmic order soon learned that the Olympians did not forgive arrogance. Arachne, a gifted weaver, boasted that her skill exceeded that of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and crafts. When challenged, Arachne's tapestry was flawless and daringly depicted the gods' failings. Though impressed, Athena punished her insolence by transforming her into a spider, doomed to weave forever in silence. Her artistry survived, but her form became a warning. Niobe, a queen blessed with many children, made the fatal mistake of mocking Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, for having only two. In swift retribution, the divine twins struck down all her children. Her husband perished from grief, and Niobe, mad with sorrow, fled to a mountaintop and turned to stone. Even in that cold form, legend says she weeps still, her pride drowned by eternal mourning. Then there was Sisyphus, the clever king who cheated death more than once, defying the gods through trickery and defiance. For this he was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill, only for it to fall each time he neared the summit. An endless, fruitless struggle, his cleverness answered with futility. Likewise, Tantalus, once a favoured guest at the gods' table, betrayed their trust by stealing ambrosia and serving them the flesh of his own son. His punishment was hunger and thirst without relief, forever reaching, never receiving. Water receded as he bent to drink, fruit withdrew as he reached to eat. Desire became torture. These stories, though set in an age of myth, reflect the deep truths of the human condition, that love, however powerful, can be undone by a single moment of doubt, that beauty can awaken life, but obsession can distort it, that pride, unchecked, draws ruin with it. And above all, that mortals, even those closest to the divine, must tread with humility, for the gods do not forget, and the cosmos does not often forgive. The trials of love and punishment in Greek mythology are not footnotes. They are the emotional core of an ancient world that understood longing as well as it understood lightning. In these stories, we do not find answers but mirrors. They show us what it means to yearn, to defy, to fall, and sometimes to rise again, not as gods, but as profoundly human. Beneath the mortal world, far below the peaks of Olympus and the shifting waves of Poseidon's seas, there lay a domain that was not chaos but order in shadow, the underworld. Unlike the realms of the living, the underworld was still, its laws eternal. It was not merely a place for punishment or sorrow. It was a mirror of the mortal world, a stage on which the soul was weighed, where memory lingered, and where myth did some of its most moral thinking. At the centre of this vast realm ruled Hades, brother of Zeus and Poseidon, and king of the dead. Yet Hades was not the devil, nor the embodiment of evil. He was a stern and solemn figure, neither cruel nor kind, but just a custodian of balance. His domain was divided into regions that reflected the many outcomes of a human life, and his role was not vengeance, but judgment and containment. If Olympus represented the ever-changing moods of divinity, the underworld was its quiet answer, fixed, reflective, and in its own way fair. When a mortal died, their soul was guided by Hermes, the messenger god, who in his role as psychopomp led them to the banks of the river Styx. There the ferryman Charon awaited. Only those who had received proper burial rites and whose mouths held a coin for passage were permitted to board his skiff. Those without coin or ceremony lingered restlessly at the river's edge, lost in limbo, forgotten by both the living and the dead. Once across, the soul entered the heart of the underworld, where the structure of eternity unfolded before them. It was not a singular realm, but a tiered cosmos of consequence. The fields of asphodel stretched first, wide and grey, where most souls wandered, those who had lived neither wickedly nor heroically. These were the ordinary dead, the farmers, the poets, the quiet mothers, the unnamed soldiers. They wandered not in torment but in forgetfulness, their identities slowly dissolving into the mist. In asphodel there was no agony, only the soft, endless fading of memory. Beyond asphodel lay the Elysian fields, or Elysium, a realm of light and gentle wind. Here dwelled those rare souls who had achieved greatness, virtue, or divine favour. Heroes, poets, lovers of wisdom. They walked in endless springtime, free from pain, their lives remembered and celebrated above. For a few, there was even the chance of rebirth, to live again, and, if virtuous once more, return to Elysium eternally. This was the Greek ideal of paradise, not a heaven of worship, but a reward for the best-lived lives. And deepest still was Tartarus, a place of punishment, far beneath even Hades's throne. It was reserved for the wicked, the treacherous, and the enemies of the gods. Here Sisyphus rolled his boulder, Tantalus reached for fruit he would never taste, Ixion spun on a wheel of fire, and the Danaïdes endlessly poured water into broken urns. Tartarus was not merely punishment, it was the mythic embodiment of consequence. Actions echoed eternally here, not as cruelty, but as divine remembrance. The entry of a soul into these realms was determined by the three judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus. Once kings of the living world, they now served as impartial arbiters, examining the deeds of a soul's life. They listened not to prayers or apologies, but to the truth of a person's actions, and in their decision the fate of the soul was sealed. Hades himself, though often feared, was not the bringer of death, but its ruler. He did not seek souls, nor interfere with the judgments passed. He maintained the structure, upheld the contracts, and kept the balance. To the Greeks, he was both necessary and unyielding. Unlike Zeus, he did not thunder. Unlike Poseidon, he did not stir the seas. He ruled silently but with absolute authority, and within this entire structure morality was not only enforced, it was told. These stories of the afterlife served a larger purpose. They were narratives of justice, of consequence, of memory. They warned mortals that the gods were watching, not only during moments of glory, but in quiet decisions, secret cruelties, and small acts of kindness. Myths of the underworld were not meant to terrify alone, they were meant to teach. To live well was to remember that death was not the end, but a mirror held up to life, that deeds echoed, that even after silence there would be judgment, not from vengeance, but from the very structure of the cosmos, from the mythic balance that held Olympus above and Tartarus below. Thus, morality in Greek mythology was never abstract. It lived in stories, in stone, in punishment and reward. It lived in Hades' cold halls and in the warm grasses of Elysium. And through these tales it whispered to every listener, "Your life matters, your choices matter, even the gods are watching." Heroes and mortals enter the stage. Part 1. Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, and the rise of mortal legend. As the dust of divine wars settled and Olympus shone from its throne above, a new kind of figure stepped into the tapestry of Greek mythology. Not gods, not monsters, but heroes. They were born of both heaven and earth, straddling the chasm between immortality and mortality, between the fury of the divine and the fragility of the human heart. These were the semi-divine children of gods and mortals, beings destined to suffer and to triumph, not because they were flawless, but because they endured. In their stories, the Greeks found reflections of their own hopes, griefs, ambitions, and virtues. The age of the hero had begun. Among the greatest of these was Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, but to the Greeks always a figure of pain and perseverance. He was the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, and from the moment of his birth he was marked by divine jealousy. Hera, the queen of the gods and wife of Zeus, despised the child born of her husband's infidelity. Even as an infant, Heracles strangled the serpents she sent to kill him in his cradle, a sign of both his strength and the trials to come. Heracles grew mighty, unmatched in power, but his strength was not protection from fate. It was, in fact, his burden. Under Hera's wrath, he was driven into a madness so consuming that he slaughtered his own wife and children, not knowing what he did until it was too late. When sanity returned, so did unbearable guilt. Seeking purification and atonement, he submitted himself to the oracle of Delphi, who commanded that he serve King Eurystheus and complete a series of impossible tasks, the 12 labors. Each labor was more than a feat of muscle. They were symbolic trials of wit, resilience, and often suffering. First he was sent to slay the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide could not be pierced by weapons. Heracles wrestled it with his bare hands, strangling it to death, then wore its skin as armor, becoming the very terror he had overcome. Next came the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent with multiple heads that regrew two for everyone severed. Realizing brute force would not win, Heracles called upon his nephew Iolaus to cauterize each neck as he cut. The battle taught him strategy and trust, virtues the gods themselves often forgot. He captured the Cyrenian hind, a sacred deer of Artemis, not with violence, but with patience. He brought down the Erymanthian boar, tamed the Stymphalian birds with Athena's guidance, and cleaned the Augean stables, not with labor, but by rerouting rivers through cunning. Each task refined him, not only in strength, but in cleverness, humility, and persistence. He subdued the Cretan bull, stole the mares of Diomedes, retrieved the girdle of Hippolyta, and rustled the cattle of Geryon, travelling to the edge of the world to do so. Finally, he stole the apples of the Hesperides, using both trickery and the strength to hold up the sky itself in Atlas's place. But perhaps most haunting of all was the 12th labour, to descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades. It was not his first brush with death, but it was his most complete. Unlike Orpheus, Heracles did not plead or charm. He wrestled the beast into submission, emerging from the land of the dead as no other mortal had before. Through these labours, Heracles was not just purified, he was transformed. He became a symbol not of invincibility but of survival. He did not walk above the world as the gods did, but through it, mud-soaked, grief-stained, often alone. His legend was carved in wounds and victories alike. The people of Greece did not pray to Heracles because he was divine. They honoured him because he endured what they could imagine and emerged stronger than fate itself. And so, Heracles became not just a hero, but a threshold, a bridge between Olympus and earth, myth and man, punishment and redemption. His strength was never just in his arms, but in the resolve to carry on even when the weight was unbearable. In the stories that followed, of Perseus, Theseus, and Atalanta, different shades of heroism would take the stage, but Heracles stood as the template, the flawed, fierce, fated mortal who bore the wrath of gods and carved his name into the stars, not because he was perfect, but because he rose every time he fell. The gods ruled the heavens, but from this point onward, it was the heroes who would capture the soul of Greece. If Heracles was the embodiment of raw strength refined through suffering, Perseus and Theseus represented something more agile, cunning, courage, and moral clarity in the face of darkness. Their myths, less brute and more precise, shifted the Greek heroic ideal from muscle to mind. These were men who, though touched by the divine, succeeded not just because of it, but because of what they chose to do with it. The story of Perseus begins not with a sword, but with a prophecy. Acrisius, the king of Argos, feared an oracle's warning that he would one day be killed by his own grandson. In a desperate attempt to cheat fate, he locked his daughter Danae in a bronze chamber, cut off from all men. But no mortal cage could keep out the gods. Zeus, in the form of golden light, descended upon Danae, and she conceived Perseus. Terrified, Acrisius cast mother and child into the sea in a wooden chest. But the sea, often cruel, was kind this time. They were found and sheltered on the island of Seriphos. There, Perseus grew into a noble youth, strong in body and firm in spirit. But his trials truly began when King Polydectes, lusting after Danae, sought to rid himself of the sun. He demanded a gift from Perseus, the head of Medusa, the only mortal among the three Gorgons, monstrous sisters whose gaze could turn any living thing to stone. It was a death sentence disguised as a task, but the gods had not forgotten Perseus. Athena gave him a polished shield, Hermes granted him a curved blade, winged sandals, and the guidance to seek the Graeae, three ancient sisters who shared a single eye and tooth. By cleverness, Perseus stole their eye and bargained for Medusa's location. Flying over desolate lands, he found her lair, a place littered with statues, frozen in final terror. But he did not look at her. With his shield as a mirror, he moved backward, careful, silent, until he struck. With one clean blow he severed her head, and from her blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the golden giant. Clutching the head, Perseus fled, pursued by Medusa's immortal sisters. He soared on winged sandals, using the head to turn his enemies to stone when needed. Returning home, he used it to petrify Polydectes and save his mother. Later, fulfilling the prophecy he was born into, he accidentally killed Acrisius, proving that even when you outrun fate, it finds you in the end. If Perseus was the symbol of destiny realized through divine gifts and clever restraint, Theseus was the emblem of justice through self-determination. Born of Aegeus, king of Athens and Aethra, a mortal woman, Theseus was raised in Troezen. Before returning to his father, he chose not the safe sea route, but the perilous land path, defeating bandits and monsters that plagued the roads. At each step he enacted justice equal to the crime. It was not just bravery, it was moral code, but his greatest trial awaited him in the labyrinthine depths of Crete. Years before, Athens had been forced into a cruel tribute by King Minos of Crete. 7 Athenian boys and 7 girls sent every 9 years to be devoured by the Minotaur, a monstrous creature, half man, half bull, kept in a maze built by Daedalus. This beast was the shameful offspring of Minos' wife and a sacred bull, born of divine punishment and hidden from the world. Yet his hunger ruled Crete. Theseus volunteered as part of the tribute, not to die, but to end the terror. When he arrived, he found an unexpected ally, Ariadne, daughter of Minos, who fell in love with him. Moved by his courage, she gave him a ball of thread to trace his path within the labyrinth. Inside the twisting, silent corridors of that impossible maze, Theseus moved with resolve. When he reached the Minotaur, there was no weapon of the gods, only his hands and his heart. In the darkness, amid the stench and bones, he fought the creature and slew it. Using the thread, he emerged from the labyrinth, leading the other Athenians to freedom. But heroism often leaves behind casualties. Though he promised to marry Ariadne, he abandoned her on the island of Naxos. The reasons vary: divine intervention, doubt, destiny. But the act darkened his triumph. Worse still, on his return to Athens, he forgot to change the black sails of mourning to white, as he had promised his father. Believing his son dead, King Aegeus threw himself into the sea, which now bears his name, the Aegean. Perseus and Theseus remind us that heroism in Greek myth is not clean or perfect. It is tangled with pain, with unintended tragedy. They are not godlike because they never fail, but because they move forward despite their failings. Their stories show us the shape of human greatness, not flawless, but relentless. In them, mortals learn that to be a hero is to bear weight of fate, of memory, of choices, and in their wake the world would never be the same again. In every stone amphitheatre echoing with verse, in every painted vase passed down through generations, and in every whispered tale told beneath starlit skies, the Greeks were not just preserving myth, they were projecting their ideals. Myth was not just fantasy, it was cultural memory, a coded expression of who the Greeks aspired to be, what they feared, and how they sought to live. Nowhere was this more potent than in the stories of heroes, where the line between gods and mortals blurred, and the values of a civilization stood etched into the trials and choices of legendary figures. Greek heroes were not saints. They lied, they stumbled, some committed terrible acts, yet they were revered not for their perfection but for their struggle, for the strength they wielded, the wit they relied upon, and the sacrifices they made. These qualities were not abstract virtues, they were the very pillars of Greek identity. Strength in the Greek heroic mold was never mere muscle. Heracles' brute power meant little without the burden it carried. His labours, performed as atonement, reflected the reality that greatness often came through suffering, not in spite of it. Strength was not just the ability to kill a monster, it was the will to carry on after losing everything. It was endurance, both physical and moral. In a land fractured by city-states where survival often depended on resilience and discipline, this theme resonated deeply. Every labor, every feat whispered, strength is only sacred when directed toward redemption. Wit, too, played a central role in the hero's journey. If Heracles embodied raw might, Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, embodied sharp intellect and adaptability. In the Odyssey, he was not the strongest of the Greeks, but he was the most clever, outwitting monsters like Polyphemus and navigating the temptations of Circe, the Sirens, and Calypso. His tale taught a different lesson, that intelligence was as vital as courage, especially in a world governed by fickle gods and unpredictable tides. Greek culture, which prized rhetoric, debate and strategy in both politics and warfare, saw in Odysseus a mirror of its own values, that cleverness could save a life where strength alone could not. But perhaps the most revered and the most tragic quality was sacrifice. Greek heroes were often called to give something up, their homes, their happiness, even their lives. Achilles, whose very name is synonymous with wrath and glory, chose a short life filled with immortal fame over a long, quiet existence. His decision to rejoin the war at Troy, knowing it would lead to his death, was not blind rage. It was a conscious offering to legacy. Similarly, Theseus's forsaking of Ariadne, while morally ambiguous, was seen by some traditions as a sacrifice made to return safely to his people. Sacrifice, to the Greeks, was not always noble. It was complex, sometimes tragic, but always essential to achieving greatness. The hero in Greek mythology, then, was not just a character in a tale. He or she was a bridge, a link between the unreachable power of the gods and the fleeting mortality of humankind. Heroes like Atalanta, the swift-footed huntress raised by bears, challenged gender roles and expectations, entering a domain usually dominated by men. Her participation in the Caledonian boar hunt and the race she ran to avoid forced marriage elevated her beyond mortal womanhood. And yet, her story also ended in transformation and loss. In that tension, she became a symbol of both empowerment and consequence. Like all heroes, she stood at the threshold of two worlds, never quite belonging to either. These figures were both admired and warned against. Their fates were often bittersweet, a reminder that to live among the gods, even for a moment, was to risk being torn apart by their fire. Yet it was this tension that gave Greek heroism its richness. It was not about blind worship. It was about aspiration within limits, daring within bounds, and the knowledge that even divine parentage could not guarantee victory over fate. Heroes, in the end, were the Greeks' way of imagining what was possible. Not what was guaranteed, not what was safe, but what was worth striving for. Through them, the ancients told stories not of perfect beings, but of flawed ones who reached beyond their station and for a brief moment touched the eternal. And through those stories, a culture carved in marble and ink, fire and silence, remembered what it meant to be human, ambitious, vulnerable, brilliant and broken, and still to fight. The Trojan War and Homeric epics, Part the One, the golden apple and the face that launched 1,000 ships. Before the clash of swords beneath the high walls of Troy, before Achilles' rage and Hector's fall, there was a golden apple, an object so small, so innocuous, yet capable of tearing apart kingdoms. This apple did not belong to a mortal world. It came from the hand of Eris, the goddess of discord, and it carried a single inscription, "To the fairest." Eris had not been invited to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, parents of Achilles. Where the gods gathered in joy, Eris brought only chaos. Into the banquet hall she cast the apple, knowing it would ignite rivalry among the goddesses. 3 divine figures rose to claim it: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. None would yield. To resolve the quarrel, the gods chose an unlikely judge: Paris, a Trojan prince living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, unaware of his royal lineage. Paris, handsome and thoughtful, was tasked with choosing who among the goddesses deserved the apple. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera promised him power and kingship. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle. But Aphrodite, with a knowing smile, offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, young and entranced, chose Aphrodite. That woman was Helen, daughter of Zeus and leader, and wife to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Some say Paris seduced her, others that Aphrodite bewitched her. But in the end, Helen left her home and husband for Troy, and with her departure, honor was broken. To the Greeks, hospitality was sacred, and Paris's act was both personal and political, a violation of trust, an offense to the gods, and a spark to war. When Menelaus discovered Helen was gone, he called upon his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, to avenge the insult. Bound by oaths sworn long ago during Helen's courtship, the kings of Greece were summoned to fulfill their pledge to protect her marriage. Thus an army was raised, not for love perhaps, but for pride, for glory, and for the defense of an ideal. Among those who answered the call were heroes whose names would echo through eternity. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, initially tried to feign madness to avoid war, but was soon compelled to join. Ajax the Great, a warrior of unmatched strength; Diomedes, fierce and bold; and Nestor, the wise elder, all took up arms, and most fatefully Achilles, son of Thetis and Peleus, was drawn into the fray, a youth prophesied to either die young with eternal fame or live long and be forgotten. His choice sealed his destiny. The fleet, 1,000 black ships, the poets say, set sail for Troy, a grand and golden city on the edge of Asia Minor. For 10 years the war raged. Walls built by Poseidon and Apollo held strong, and the Trojans, led by King Priam and his sons Hector and Paris, defended their homeland with valor and sorrow. The battlefield became a stage upon which both men and gods played out their dramas, and all of it, the betrayal, the wrath, the blood and beauty, was captured by a blind poet whose words would shape Western memory. Homer, in his Iliad and Odyssey, did not just tell the story of the Trojan War. He crystallized its myth, giving names to every grief, every triumph, every flicker of pride and doubt that lived in the hearts of heroes. The abduction of Helen was more than an elopement. It was a fracture in the world's moral order, an affront to Zeus's law of hospitality, a challenge to the gods themselves. And as the ships reached Troy's shores, bearing warriors, dreams, and doom, the war that followed would not only test the strength of men, but the very fabric of fate. The gods did not stay distant. They chose sides. Hera and Athena, slighted by Paris, aligned with the Greeks. Aphrodite, protector of love and Paris, fought for Troy. Zeus watched with detachment and unease, and as divine powers whispered into mortal ears, as the dust of battle rose to meet the heavens, the line between myth and man blurred beyond recognition. The Trojan War had begun, and in its shadow the world would never be the same. As the ships beached on the Trojan shores and the war entered its relentless rhythm, it became clear that the conflict would be more than a siege. It would be a crucible for names that would echo for millennia. Among them, Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus rose not just as warriors, but as emblems of different forms of greatness. Through them, the war became poetry, and the poetry became culture. Achilles, the greatest of the Achaeans, was not born merely to fight. He was born to choose. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, knew from prophecy that he had two paths, one of long life and obscurity, the other of short life and eternal glory. And so, though she dipped him in the river Styx to make him nearly invincible, she could not shield him from fate. Raised by the wise centaur Chiron, Achilles was educated in music, medicine, and war, but it was wrath that would shape his legend. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles' story does not begin in triumph, but in anger. When Agamemnon, leader of the Greek forces, dishonors him by seizing his war prize, Achilles withdraws from battle. It is a sulk, yes, but also a protest against the misuse of power, a statement that honor, once wounded, cannot be ignored. His absence nearly leads to Greek defeat. And then comes Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, perhaps his soul's other half. Disguised in Achilles' armor, Patroclus leads the Greeks into battle but is slain by Hector, the noble Trojan prince. Achilles' grief is not quiet, it is volcanic. His return to war is not for conquest but for revenge, and in that rage he becomes almost godlike. He kills Hector in a duel that shakes the heavens, then drags his body around the walls of Troy, defiling it in pain and fury. But even in vengeance, Achilles is capable of grace. When King Priam, Hector's father, sneaks into the Greek camp to beg for his son's body, Achilles is moved, not by threats or flattery, but by shared grief. He sees in Priam the father he will never return to, and in that moment, wrath softens to empathy. He returns Hector's body, and the two mourn together. Achilles' own death comes soon after, struck by Paris with an arrow, guided, some say, by Apollo, into the only vulnerable part of his body, his heel. If Achilles was fire, Hector was earth, steady, grounded, bound to duty. As the defender of Troy, he bore the burden of fate with grace. Unlike Achilles, who fought for glory, Hector fought for home, for his wife Andromache, for his child, for his city. He knew Troy would fall, he knew he would die, but still he fought. When he met Achilles in single combat, it was not as a reckless warrior, but as a man walking into the storm with open eyes. His death was not just a loss for Troy, it was the beginning of the end. And then there was Odysseus, the trickster, the tactician, the man of many turns. While others fought with swords, Odysseus wielded his mind. It was he who devised the plan of the Trojan horse, the ruse that would breach the unbreachable walls of Troy. The Greeks, pretending to sail away, left a wooden horse as an offering. Inside, hidden soldiers waited. The Trojans brought it into the city. That night, the Greeks emerged, opened the gates, and Troy burned. But Odysseus's journey was far from over. His Odyssey, chronicled in the epic that bears his name, took 10 years and countless trials. He faced the Cyclops Polyphemus, escaped the enchantress Circe, resisted the sirens, navigated the whirlpool Charybdis and the monster Scylla, and was detained by Calypso for 7 long years. Yet always his thoughts were on Ithaca, his wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus. His homecoming was not easy. He arrived in disguise, tested loyalties, and reclaimed his place not with celebration but with strategy, and earned justice. These stories, of rage and reason, of loyalty and longing, are not just entertainment. They are foundational myths captured in the twin epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Through them, the Greeks defined what it meant to be human. In Achilles, they saw passion and the consequences of pride. In Hector, they honored courage without reward. In Odysseus, they celebrated intelligence, endurance, and the bittersweet nature of return. Homer's works were more than tales. They were cultural scripture, recited by rhapsodes, studied by philosophers, painted onto urns, etched into the psyche of a civilization. Every child who learned to speak also learned of Troy. Every citizen knew that glory might end in ruin, that even the greatest must bow to fate, and that home in the end was the truest victory. And so, through the words of a blind poet, the Trojan War became memory, not just of what happened, but of what must never be forgotten. The fall of Troy was not simply the end of a siege, it was the unraveling of a world shaped by gods, bound by fate, and propelled by the fire of mortal pride. After 10 long years of bloodshed, prophecy, and divine manipulation, the city that once stood as a beacon of eastern splendor fell not to brute force, but to guile, deception, and a gift carved in wood, the Trojan horse. The tale is as haunting as it is brilliant. Conceived by Odysseus, the wooden horse was presented as an offering to Athena, a peace gift from the Greeks as they pretended to sail away in defeat. But within its massive belly hid Greek warriors, silent and waiting. Sinon, a cunning Greek left behind, spun a masterful lie to the Trojans. He claimed the Greeks had fled, and that the horse, if brought into the city, would secure Troy's divine protection. Despite the warnings of Laocoon, a Trojan priest who famously cried, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," the horse was pulled inside the walls. Laocoon and his sons were soon killed by sea serpents, whether by fate or the gods is uncertain, and his death was taken as a sign of divine favor. That night, while Troy slept in fragile celebration, Sinon opened the belly of the beast. The warriors descended from within, opened the city gates, and signaled the return of the Greek fleet. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. Menelaus stormed the palace to reclaim Helen. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, slaughtered King Priam at the altar of Zeus, and fires devoured homes, temples, and memories alike. The once golden city of Troy was reduced to ash and ruin, but the destruction of Troy did not mark the end of the war's consequences. It marked the beginning of a deeper divine reckoning. The gods who had taken sides and stoked the flames of conflict now turned their wrath upon the victors. Many Greeks, arrogant in triumph, disrespected the sacred burning temples and dragging captives from holy places. In doing so, they offended the very deities who had once favored them. Athena, once a patron of Greek wisdom, was enraged by the desecration of her temple. Poseidon, angered by the Greeks' hubris, lashed the sea with storms. As the Achaeans sailed home, retribution followed them across the waves. Ships were shattered, fleets lost, and many heroes would never see their homeland again. Those who survived returned not to fanfare, but to ruin, betrayal, and exile. Agamemnon, king of kings, returned to Mycenae only to be murdered in his own palace by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover. Ajax the Lesser, who defiled a temple during the sack of Troy, was killed by Poseidon at sea. And even Odysseus, who had delivered victory, wandered for 10 years through trials and temptation before reclaiming his throne. The divine fallout extended beyond punishment. The very order of the cosmos had been disturbed. The gods had meddled deeply in mortal affairs, and now the boundaries between Olympus and earth felt dangerously thin. Some gods, like Aphrodite, emerged with their influence still intact. Her lineage, through Aeneas, would continue in Roman myth. Others, like Apollo and Hera, grew quieter in the centuries that followed, their narratives less heroic and more reflective. The sack of Troy was not a triumph, it was a turning point. The gods, once the unquestioned masters of fate, had revealed themselves as fallible, emotional, and dangerously involved in the affairs of mortals. And mortals, having glimpsed the terrible cost of divine entanglement, began to tell stories that no longer glorified war, but questioned it. They began to reimagine heroes not as demigods beyond reproach, but as mirrors of human fragility. From the ashes of Troy, something else rose, something quieter but more enduring, a new relationship between myth and meaning. The Iliad did not end with celebration, but with mourning. The Odyssey did not glorify conquest, but yearn for home. These stories taught that every flame of glory casts a long shadow of loss, that even the greatest city can fall, that even the most powerful gods must answer for what they set in motion. And so the fall of Troy was not only a tale of destruction, it was a moral reckoning written into the bones of Greek culture, a reminder that the gods are not always just, that victory is not always noble, and that the cost of pride, divine or mortal, is always paid in full. The Twilight of Myth, Part 1, The Long Road Home and the Seeds of Rome. When the fires of Troy dimmed to smouldering ruins and the cries of the dying gave way to the silence of ash, a heavy stillness settled over the ancient world. The great war was over, but its aftermath would ripple far beyond the Aegean. The age of heroes, once lit by divine favor and epic deeds, began to fade, not with a grand finale, but with a slow unraveling of journeys, of wandering souls, and of stories half wrapped in grief. Among the returning warriors, few suffered more or traveled farther than Odysseus, king of Ithaca. And in the ruins of Troy, a new figure emerged, Aeneas, son of Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite, carrying with him the spark of a future empire. The story of Odysseus begins not with glory, but with delay. Though he had been the mind behind the wooden horse, he was not spared the gods' wrath. For 10 years after Troy's fall, he was denied safe passage home. The sea itself seemed to conspire against him. Poseidon, insulted by the blinding of his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, cursed Odysseus to wander, a punishment as poetic as it was cruel. His name, after all, meant trouble. What followed was not a hero's march, but a long, meandering odyssey through strange lands and moral trials. On the island of the Lotus Eaters, his men nearly forgot their pasts in a haze of forgetfulness. In the cave of Polyphemus, Odysseus's cleverness saved them, but also doomed him to Poseidon's vengeance. He faced the enchantress Circe, who turned men into swine and navigated between the twin horrors of Scylla and Charybdis, losing men in both trials. He heard the voices of the sirens who promised knowledge in their deadly song. And he descended into the underworld, where he met the shades of fallen comrades and learned the fate of his own house. Through it all, Odysseus was not only tested in strength and wit, but in identity. The journey home was less a return to Ithaca and more a rediscovery of self, of purpose, of what it meant to be a man, not just a warrior. When he finally reached Ithaca, disguised and weathered, he did not rush into his palace. He waited, he watched. And only then did he reclaim his throne, not through brute force but with strategy and restraint, a final affirmation of the cunning that had defined him. But as Odysseus struggled to return, another journey began, one that would carry myth from Greece to Rome. Aeneas, a prince of Troy, had survived the destruction of his city not because of defiance, but because of duty. Guided by the gods and carrying his aged father on his back, Aeneas fled Troy with a band of survivors. His mission was not revenge, but continuity. He bore not just the legacy of Troy, but a divine command to found a new people in a new land. This story, preserved in Virgil's Aeneid, would become the foundational myth of Rome. It begins in the ruins of one world and ends in the birth of another. Aeneas wandered like Odysseus across seas and lands. He faced storms sent by Juno, the Roman echo of Hera, who still burned with hatred for Troy. He loved and left Dido, queen of Carthage, whose death would foreshadow centuries of war between Rome and her city. He journeyed into the underworld, guided by the Sibyl, where he met the shade of his father and saw the souls of future Roman heroes waiting to be born. Aeneas was not a typical Greek hero. He did not chase glory for its own sake. His defining virtue was pietas, a Roman ideal of piety, duty and devotion. He obeyed the gods even when it broke his heart. He sacrificed personal desire for collective destiny. And in doing so, he marked a shift in the mythic world, from individual fame to communal purpose. The stories of Odysseus and Aeneas together symbolized the twilight of the heroic age. No longer were myths centered only on divine warfare and titanic pride. They became reflective. They explored consequences. They turned inward. Where once gods walked freely among mortals, now they whispered through dreams, guided from afar, or faded into metaphor. The boundary between the mortal and divine began to close, and in that closing gap, something new took root. Philosophy, history and literature, tools by which the Greeks and later the Romans would begin to reinterpret their myths not as literal truths, but as allegories of human experience. But for now, as Aeneas sailed toward the future and Odysseus returned to the past, the ancient world stood poised at a threshold. Behind it lay the age of heroes. Ahead waited the age of men. As the stories of Troy and its scattered heroes faded into the dusty corners of memory, the world they had once shaped began to shift. No longer did gods descend regularly in bolts of fire or speak through burning oracles. No longer did men claim to trace their bloodline directly to Zeus or Poseidon. A new wind was rising across the Greek world, a wind not of prophecy but of reason. The divine favor that had once swayed the outcome of every war, blessed every harvest, and haunted every curse began to waver. Not vanish entirely. Gods were still honored, temples still stood, and sacrifices were still offered, but something deeper was changing. Mortals no longer looked to Olympus for guidance as they once had. Instead, they began to look inward. The grand tales of Hera's vengeance or Apollo's passions began to feel distant to those walking the polished stones of Athens. The citizens of the polis, now engaged in politics, democracy and debate, began to question whether these old stories truly reflected the nature of existence. Could gods be both all-powerful and yet behave so pettily? Could fate be rigid when experience showed that reason and choice shaped life so dramatically? This questioning spirit was not born from irreverence, but from curiosity, from a desire to understand not just what the myths told, but why they were told in the first place. And into this landscape stepped three thinkers who would forever alter the place of myth in the human mind: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, did not write myths, nor did he embrace them blindly. He walked the agora asking questions that unseated assumptions. He asked not who made lightning, but what is justice, not how did Zeus punish hubris, but what is the good life. In Plato's dialogues, we see Socrates challenge traditional stories, sometimes with biting satire. He called out the contradictions in the myths, how gods who demanded justice could themselves act unjustly. He didn't deny the cultural value of myths, but sought a truer understanding beneath them. Plato, his student, took the critique further. In his vision of the ideal city, the Republic, he famously argued that certain myths should be censored. Stories that depicted gods as cruel, deceitful, or morally weak could corrupt the soul, he claimed. For Plato, myths were not dismissed but re-engineered. They should reflect eternal truths, not just dramatic tales. His own allegory of the cave stands as a kind of myth in itself, not about gods or monsters, but about illusion, reality, and enlightenment. In this way, Plato replaced divine thunder with philosophical clarity, showing that the deepest stories may not be those told by the muses, but those discovered through reason. Aristotle, ever the scientist, saw myth from yet another angle. In his Poetics, he dissected storytelling itself, not for its divine origin, but for its emotional and moral function. He argued that tragedy, rooted in myth, allowed people to experience catharsis, a purging of pity and fear. He analyzed characters like Oedipus not as cautionary tales about fate alone, but as studies in flawed choices and human consequence. For Aristotle, myths remained valuable, but only when understood as human dramas, not divine dictations. This intellectual evolution did not kill mythology, it transformed it. The gods were no longer literal beings on mountaintops, but symbolic truths, metaphors for internal conflict, forces of nature, or psychological archetypes. Zeus became the idea of order, Dionysus, the embodiment of chaos and ecstasy. Athena, the voice of wisdom and restraint. Myth became language, not instruction. In this twilight, artists, playwrights, and poets continued to tell the old stories, but now they shimmered with layers. A play by Euripides was not just about Medea's vengeance, but a meditation on the limits of love and the cost of pride. A sculpture of Apollo did not merely show a god, but an ideal of proportion and beauty. Myth lived on, but no longer as dogma. It became a mirror, reflecting back the growing complexity of human thought. In temples, incense still curled toward the heavens. In homes, libations were poured. But in the academies, in the stoas and shaded groves of Athens, something profound was unfolding. The belief that understanding the world did not require fearing the gods, but thinking deeply about ourselves. Thus, as the mythic age dimmed, a philosophical dawn broke. It was quieter, more disciplined, less divine, but it did not forget the old stories. It preserved them, reinterpreted them, and let them breathe again in new forms. For even as men began to question the gods, they still found themselves in awe of the mystery that first gave birth to those gods, the mystery of existence itself, the legacy of Greek mythology. Part 1. From Olympus to Empire, from marble to canvas. Long after the fires of myth had cooled and the philosophers had debated the gods into metaphor, the legacy of Greek mythology began a new life, one that would carry its stories, forms, and faces across empires, centuries, and cultures. Though the Olympians no longer walked among mortals, their shadows stretched far and wide, taking root in art, architecture, politics, and even religion. What began on the peaks of Mount Olympus did not vanish. It transformed, migrating from the sacred to the symbolic, from Greece to Rome, and eventually into the very foundations of Western civilization. One of the most visible and immediate legacies of Greek mythology lies in its adoption and adaptation by the Romans. When Rome encountered Greece, first through admiration, then conquest, it did not reject the Greek pantheon. Instead, it embraced it, renaming the gods but preserving their stories. Zeus became Jupiter, king of the Roman gods. Hera became Juno, goddess of marriage. Poseidon was Neptune, ruler of the seas. Ares, the warlike Mars. Aphrodite, the seductive Venus. Though their personalities and associations were adjusted to fit Roman values, Mars became a more noble figure than the impulsive Ares, for instance. The core myths remained intact. The Romans even grafted their origin story onto the remnants of Greek legend, claiming descent from Aeneas, the Trojan hero who fled the fall of Troy. This merging of mythologies did more than preserve the old stories. It gave them imperial purpose. The gods now served not just to explain nature or human behavior, but to legitimize empire. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas. Temples to Jupiter, Optimus Maximus crowned Roman forums. Public sculptures, coins, and architecture echoed the grandeur of Olympus. In this way, mythology became a tool of statecraft, and Greek stories wore Roman robes without losing their original essence. Beyond the political, the artistic legacy of Greek mythology bloomed across centuries in stone, pigment, and form. The Greeks had already elevated art into a realm of divine representation. Their sculptures of Apollo, Aphrodite, and Athena were not just depictions, they were ideals. The smooth curve of a marble arm, the serene gaze of a goddess, the poised energy of a bronze hero, all captured not only beauty, but meaning. Art was not merely for decoration, it was a form of storytelling, of reverence, of philosophy in visual form. When the Roman Empire fell and the medieval world turned its gaze inward toward Christian doctrine, the old gods receded from public reverence, but they were never forgotten. They waited, dormant, until the world was ready to dream in marble again. That moment came in the Renaissance. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as Europe rediscovered the classical texts of antiquity, Greek mythology surged once more to the surface. Artists like Sandro Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo found in these ancient stories a wellspring of inspiration. Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, with its luminous goddess rising from the sea, became an emblem of rebirth, not just of a deity, but of human beauty, form, and imagination. Michelangelo's sculptures and the architecture of Florence echoed the proportions of Greek statuary, balancing divinity with humanism. In these works, myth became a celebration of life, not just a memory of gods. Meanwhile, architects drew inspiration from the columns and symmetry of Greek temples. The Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, once used to honor deities, now framed libraries, courthouses, and state buildings. The neoclassical movement, which flourished in the 18th and 19th centuries, reimagined Greek ideals for a modern world. In Washington, D.C., in Paris, in London, buildings were shaped not only with stone, but with a mythic heritage, as if to say that the wisdom and beauty of the Greeks could still guide a world increasingly governed by reason and republics. And so, the legacy of Greek mythology endures not only in the pages of epic poems or the dusty halls of museums, it surrounds us, often invisibly, in the names of planets and constellations, in the brands we wear, Nike, Amazon, Pandora, in the statues that line our parks, and in the stories we tell about love, hubris, fate, and transformation. These myths may no longer be prayers, but they are still symbols, still mirrors. The gods of Olympus have become ghosts, yes, but not silent ones. Their voices still echo in galleries, in marble, in architecture that reaches toward the sky, just as they once did. And in that reaching, in that enduring human desire to understand ourselves through story, the flame of myth still burns, quiet but eternal. Even as the gods withdrew from their thrones and the philosophers rose to prominence, certain images, certain figures, and certain questions from Greek mythology refused to fade. They lingered, not just in books or temples, but in the deep unconscious of human storytelling. Among these echoes, a few symbols rise above the rest, each one carrying within it not just a myth, but a truth about the human condition. They are the fragments of Olympus we still carry with us, Medusa, the labyrinth, Pegasus, and the questions they raise of fate, pride, love, and the possibility of becoming something more. Medusa, perhaps the most haunting figure of all, remains frozen in our cultural imagination. A woman transformed into a monster, her hair writhing with serpents, her gaze capable of turning flesh to stone, Medusa is both terrifying and tragic. In one version of the myth, she was once a beautiful maiden, a priestess of Athena who was assaulted by Poseidon in the goddess's temple. Athena, enraged not at the god but at the defilement of her sacred space, cursed Medusa. From victim to monster, from woman to warning, Medusa's transformation reveals a darker side of myth, one in which beauty and power become dangerous and where women are often punished for the violence done to them. And yet, Medusa was not forgotten. She was slain by Perseus, who used her severed head as a weapon even after death. Her image adorned shields and breastplates, not as a symbol of evil but of protection, of warding off chaos. Over time, Medusa came to represent something more complicated, the fear of the unknown, the power of the gaze, the rage of the wronged. In modern times, she has been reinterpreted as a symbol of female rage, of transformation born from trauma. In her, myth survives, not as a relic, but as a mirror of evolving cultural values. Then there is the labyrinth, the twisting, endless maze built by Daedalus to contain the Minotaur, a monstrous child born from divine punishment and mortal folly. The labyrinth is more than a structure. It is a state of being. It represents confusion, entrapment, and the dark corners of the self that must be navigated. Theseus, armed with a sword and a thread given by Ariadne, ventures into its heart. The thread is more than a tool. It is memory, love, logic. The myth reminds us that bravery alone does not defeat the beast within. It must be accompanied by guidance, connection, and the ability to find our way back. The labyrinth endures because it speaks to an experience that every human shares, the feeling of being lost within one's own life, of moving through complexity in search of a center or an exit. In literature, psychology, even game design, the labyrinth lives on as a metaphor for identity, for trauma, for existence itself. And then, ascending from the ground-bound world of monsters and mazes, there is Pegasus, the winged horse born from the blood of Medusa, leaping into the sky. A creature of paradox, Pegasus is both the child of death and a symbol of freedom, of divine inspiration. In myth, he is tamed by the hero Bellerophon, who rides him to slay the Chimera, a beast of fire and fury. But Bellerophon's story ends in hubris. He tries to fly Pegasus to Mount Olympus itself, to claim a place among the gods. Zeus strikes him down. Pegasus, however, is spared. He rises alone and eventually becomes a constellation in the night sky. Pegasus represents the double edge of aspiration. He is the creative spark, the moment of flight, the artistic urge to transcend limits. But he is also a warning that to reach for the divine without humility invites a fall. And so, whether as symbol of poetic inspiration or impossible beauty, Pegasus reminds us to honor ambition with grace, These symbols endure because they are not confined to one era. They evolve just as the questions they raise do, questions that have haunted every generation since the myths were first whispered under starry skies. Fate. Are our lives preordained, like Oedipus's, or can we carve our own paths? Hubris. When does pride become danger? Is it noble to defy the gods or foolish? Love. Can it conquer death as Orpheus believed? Can it redeem the broken or destroy the mighty? Transformation. Is change a punishment as in Arachne's web, or a gift like Daphne becoming a tree to escape Apollo? Greek mythology does not answer these questions with certainty. It poses them as stories, as puzzles in narrative form. That is their enduring power. The myths are not rules carved in stone, but flickering torches we pass down through time, each generation interpreting the light in its own way. And so the symbols remain. On buildings, in books, in paintings and poems. They do not fade, they evolve. They whisper still, not in thunderous declarations, but in the quiet places of our minds where wonder lives. There is a reason these stories never truly died. A reason why, long after the last temple was abandoned, the last oracle silenced, and the last statue eroded by time, the myths of Greece continue to stir something deep within us. It is not simply because they are old, nor is it merely because they are beautiful, though they are. It is because, at their core, these myths are not just relics of a distant civilization, they are reflections of us. They are mirrors, and they are mysteries. A mirror shows us who we are, even when we are not ready to see it. Greek mythology does this with startling clarity. Through the ambitions of Icarus, we see our own yearning to rise above our station, to test the limits, to fly. Through the jealousy of Hera, the grief of Demeter, the rage of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, we are confronted with ourselves, our flaws, our fears, our dreams. The Greeks never separated their gods from their emotions. The divine was not serene and distant. It was volatile, raw, painfully human. In that closeness, the myths remind us that the line between man and God is not drawn in power, but in awareness. The stories of Prometheus, of Pandora, of Narcissus do not feel alien because they belong to another age. They feel familiar because they still echo through our behavior today. Every time we overreach, disobey out of principle, open something we were warned not to, or fall in love with a reflection of ourselves, we walk alongside the ancients. The mirror does not lie. It simply waits. But myth is more than mirror. It is mystery too. It is the breath between logic and dream, between history and imagination. The Greeks did not craft their myths only to explain the world. They crafted them to enchant it, to wrap ordinary events in layers of wonder, to say not just what happened, but what it meant. Why does the sun rise? Because Helios drives his chariot across the sky. Why does the sea rage? Because Poseidon is angered. Why must we suffer? Because Pandora opened the box, or perhaps because suffering is the price of hope. These stories do not aim for precision. They aim for truth of a different kind, a truth that can only be told through metaphor, through symbolism, through the rhythm of a tale. And in this way, mythology is an invitation not to believe blindly, but to feel deeply, to ask questions not because we expect answers, but because the act of asking brings us closer to meaning. Why do we fall in love with myths? Because they are not fixed. They shift, shimmer, and reshape themselves each time they are told. They are not bound to the past. They belong to the imagination, and thus to eternity. Greek mythology in particular carries this dual nature with unmatched elegance. It is structured yet fluid. It offers names and genealogies, wars and dates, and yet it refuses to be pinned down. The myths contradict themselves, overlap, diverge. There are multiple versions of every tale, and no single one is ever definitive. This was not seen as a flaw by the Greeks, but a feature. The truth was not found in the facts, but in the variations, in the possibilities. And that is perhaps the greatest mystery of myth, that it survives by changing. It adapts to the storyteller, the listener, the time. In one era, Medusa is a monster, in another, a victim, in yet another, a symbol of rage reclaimed. In one version, Icarus is a warning, in another, a celebration of courage. The myths endure because they welcome reinterpretation. They leave room for us. They are not just ancient stories, they are living dialogues between the past and the present. So when we speak of myth as mirror and mystery, we speak of a legacy that is both deeply personal and endlessly universal. We speak of something that lies at the heart of human culture, not just in statues and epics, but in our movies, our poetry, our metaphors, and the silent stories we tell ourselves to make sense of things. We may no longer worship Zeus or sacrifice to Artemis, but we still climb mountains in search of meaning. We still look at the stars and wonder what guides us. We still turn to stories, complex, flawed, beautiful stories, to understand love, loss, triumph and fate. In this, myth is not just a memory of a forgotten time. It is a companion, walking quietly beside us, illuminating who we are with every step. A mirror, a mystery, a myth that never ends. Outro. Echoes in the marble Greek mythology does not end. Not really. It does not close its eyes or fall silent with the last word of a story or the crumble of a temple stone. Instead, it echoes, softly, endlessly, through the quiet corridors of time, touching everything it passes, not as thunder but as whisper, not as doctrine but as dream. It lingers in the language of the stars, where constellations bear the names of heroes and beasts once sung by poets. Orion hunts forever in the sky, Andromeda waits in chains of light, Cassiopeia sits on her cosmic throne, still too proud to bow. These are not just patterns of starlight, they are reminders stitched across the heavens that story and cosmos were once one. It murmurs in rivers and mountains where nymphs once danced and gods once hid. The springs of the world still carry their names, Helicon, Parnassus, Styx, not as signs of belief, but as traces of memory. Nature and myth are entwined here, inseparable. The earth remembers even when we forget. It hums in the quiet moments of wonder when a child first sees lightning and imagines a god behind it. When someone falls in love and feels as though the stars themselves were involved. When grief feels mythic and joy feels divine. In those moments we are not so far from the Greeks, who used stories not to escape life, but to make sense of it. And so if you carry anything with you from this long walk through myth and marble, let it be this, not belief, but imagination. The kind of imagination that sees more than surface, that asks not only what is, but what could be, the kind of imagination that built Mount Olympus in the minds of mortals and filled it with gods who laughed, wept, raged and loved, just as we do. Carry that spark with you gently. Let it light corners of your thoughts, your dreams, your questions. Let it remind you that behind every ordinary moment there may be a thread of the extraordinary waiting to be seen. That myth is not gone. It simply changed shape into poem, into story, into thought. And now, as you drift slowly, softly, through the mists of sleep, let the voices of ancient times fade into hush. The wars have ended, the gods have retreated, the heroes have laid down their arms, but the stories still breathe. Somewhere, on a distant mountain or hidden within the folds of your mind, Olympus still stands, not in stone but in story. Rest now, traveller, you've walked among gods.